Know that. All right. Anyone else wanna share? So for Alan and Faye who just joined us, we're saying our names and then someone who we think of as a prophet. It can be, you could say anyone from Jeremiah to Leonard Cohen to you just heard, the inventor of the mRNA, just someone who you feel is a prophet in whatever way you want to take that. I'm not defining prophecy for anyone. So Lee or Charlie or Cheryl, Lewis, Eileen, anyone ready to hop in?
All right. Seeing you called on me, Rabbi. I always think of Noah as a really interesting prophet just because he got it wrong so many times. I mean, he kept saying, no, that isn't what I'm going to do. That isn't really what God wants me to do, and was wrong, like almost every single time. And yet we consider him a prophet. And I just think that's something to learn from, that when we think we know exactly what we need to do, maybe we don't. So.
Wonderful. Yeah. So prophets don't always get it right. That's a really interesting idea there. Wonderful. Anyone else? An idea of someone who you look to as a prophet? Yeah, Lewis?
We all end up thinking of those prophets as the people on those morning talk shows on Sunday mornings.
Which morning talk shows?
Everything on CNN.
Oh, the prognosticators.
Yeah, there are morning prophets.
Right. So that's an interesting question. Is part of the role of prophecy some sort of future telling, that if you guess enough and you happen to guess right enough times, do you become a prophet? Right. That's a wonderful point, that we sometimes give people the title of prophet in that way. Faye, it looks like you're unmuting. Go for it.
I are talking and kind of saying, I don't know about, hush, Lila. We're not really prophet, I don't know, but someone who has a vision for the future, a Ben-Gurion, someone with a vision, to me, is prophetic. Maybe not a prophet, but something about their being.
Yeah, wonderful. The teasing apart of like someone might be prophetic while not necessarily being or can someone be prophetic without being a prophet, or do you have to be a prophet to be prophetic? How does that all work? It's a really interesting point, and it's a great question, and I don't know if there's one right answer to that. But I love that point, so thank you. And Ben-Gurion is a great name to throw out there. All right, just a last quick call to Charlie or to Cheryl or to Eileen if you wanna share.
I'd say the philosopher Michel Foucault.
Foucault. Wonderful. Thank you. And then Cheryl, did I see you unmute also?
I was working on it. I just got the baby out of the bath, so he's like currently running around in the nude in my living room right now. So I'm a little busy. I've heard Michael Moore be called a prophet before.
Yeah. Sounds like the baby agrees.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have picked that word for myself, but he's gotten some things right. That's for sure.
Absolutely. All right. So there's an interesting question here. What exactly does it mean to be a prophet? Does it mean to get things right? Does it mean to speak, as Nathan Goldman said, to speak a little bit of truth to power? What is the role of the prophet? And so we're going to look at that a little bit today. What we're going to do first is kind of get a bigger overview of Nach, of these other books of the Bible. We often spend a lot of our time in Judaism focused on Torah, focused on the first 5 books, and we often spend less time actually on the second 2 sections that we have of the Bible, of Nevi'im and Ketuvim. So just like we did with Torah, before we dive into the text, I'm going to give the 30,000 foot overview of kind of what the whole thing is. It's going to be quick. It's going to be a broad strokes thing. It's not going to include everything. And if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me or ask them when I'm done. But this is just kind of because, again, we can't cover all of Nach in one class. We're going to zoom in on one part, but I don't want you to not understand kind of the bigger scope of what we're working with here. So Nach starts at the end, right after the end of the Torah. So the Israelites are right on the banks of the Jordan, preparing to cross in, and the beginning of this section is the conquering of the land of Israel in the book of Joshua. And then the beginning of the book of Judges is this attempt to take over the land of Israel. It's a mixed bag of success. The Israelites all manage to kind of move in, but they don't really displace the people who are already there, which leads to a long cycle called the Judges cycle, of the Israelites becoming too close with the previous owners of the land, starting to worship all of the foreign gods, God getting angry with them, other people rising up and taking over them, and then a judge appearing. The judges you might be familiar with, such as Devorah, Samson, and the like, and they would come usually kind of these warrior figures, and they would, defeat the enemy, maybe the Philistines, maybe the Hittites, turn everyone back to God. Things would go well for 40 years or so, and then they would all start worshiping the other gods again because they forgot how good God was, and then we have the whole cycle would repeat itself. We then, once we're done with all of the judges, we get to Samuel, who is kind of the first prophet, and Samuel brings the kings, the era of kings. So you get Saul, the first king. He was okay. He was good. Then he wasn't so good. Then we get David, the second king. Really good. We love David. Big David fans in Judaism. And David is the king for a long time, but he does not complete. And David takes over Jerusalem, which is also known as Ir David, the city of Jerusalem. But he doesn't complete the building of the temple. That's left to his son Solomon. Solomon, king number 3, very good, also very wise, completes the construction of the temple, but then towards the end of his life has a few hundred wives. They, cloud his judgment a little bit, and things start to go downhill toward the end of Solomon's life. We then get 2 books of Kings that are mostly about really bad kings. The kings of Israel post Solomon don't really do such great stuff. We're not such big fans of theirs. After that, we get into the prophets. This is your Isaiahs, your Jeremiahs, your Ovadiahs, your Habakkuk's, your Micahs, all of those guys. And that's where we're going to spend more time today. So I'm not going to talk about them too much, but essentially these are all what are known as literary prophets. So these are all prophets who are writing often in poetry, often in verse, often in metaphor, and they are writing words of prophecy and words of warning and words of intense longing for closeness with God, and sometimes words of intense closeness with God. You also get Ezekiel, all of his visions. That's all there in prophets. After that, we move out of the section of prophets, out of Nevi'im, and into Ketuvim, which means writings. That starts with the book of Psalms, 150 chapters, ascribed to David. David is the classical author of the book of Psalms. Lots of poetry. You all know what Psalms are. I don't think I have to describe that in too much detail. Then after the book of Psalms, we get into the last 2 sections, which are wisdom writings and Megillot, or scrolls or stories. So the wisdom writings include Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and Job. And then the scrolls or the stories include Esther, Ruth, Lamentations, and other books like that. And then very, very, very end of the Bible, you get 2 books of Chronicles, which is basically just a retelling again of the whole Bible. No one really you also get Ezra and Nehemiah. There are a couple of Second Temple era prophets. They're like the very end, if you're going chronologically, of the Bible. The Bible actually gets all the way to the building of the Second Temple, and that's where the biblical period ends, with Ezra and Nehemiah. Then you get Chronicles, which is a retelling of everything. No one really reads Chronicles that much, but it's true. But it's there. It's interesting. It's a good retelling, and it recaps everything nicely and ties everything up in a bow. So before we get to what we're really going to talk about, which is Nevi'im, which is prophets, I wanted to share with you another video from Hayehudim Ba'im, because you enjoyed the one last week. This one comes from Ketuvim, from writing, specifically the book of Esther. So I'm... Share my screen. All right. And there's English subtitles.
ויהי בימי אחשוורוש, איש יהודי היה בשושן הבירה, ושמו מרדכי. ויהי אומן את אסתר בת דודו, והנערה יפת תואר וטובת מראה. יש! אסתר?
נכון.
ונכון שאחשוורוש לא כל כך מרוצה מוושתי בזמן האחרון.
נו.
אז ככה, את הולכת לארמון, עושה לאחשוורוש קצת חנדלח, קצת פוצי מוצי, והופ, אחשוורוש לא רוצה להשמיד אותנו.
אוקיי, אחלה רעיון, אבל זה לא נראה לך קצת בעייתי לשלוח אותי לאחשוורוש. זה קצת עושה אותי...
קצת מה?
זונה?
איך זונה?
כאילו, שלא תחשוב, זה רעיון טוב, אבל זה קצת מוציא אותי, אתה יודע, זונה.
איך זונה?
טוב, אולי לא הבנתי. אתה רוצה שאני אהיה עם אחשוורוש?
כן.
וקצת פוצי מוצי?
להציל את העם.
נו, אז זה כמו זונה.
לא, זה לא כמו זונה.
זה לא כמו זונה, זה זונה.
זה לא זונה.
זה כן זונה.
זה לא זונה.
זה כן זונה.
איך זה זונה?
איך זה לא זונה? אתה שולח אותי להיות עם גבר זר?
כן.
לך יוצא מזה משהו?
בוודאי, אני מציל את עצמי ממוות.
נו, אז זונה.
רגע אחד, אסתר.
זונה.
אסתר?
זונה.
אסתר, שנייה.
אתה רוצה שאני אהיה זונה?
לא זונה.
זה זונה.
אני יכול להגיד מילה?
המילה הזאת זה זונה?
לא.
אז לא.
אסתר, תביני טוב טוב, אם התוכנית שלנו תצליח, העם שלנו יכיר לך תודה, יכתבו עלייך שירים, יכניסו אותך לתנ"ך.
וואלה יופי, דוד המלך, ירמיהו הנביא ואסתר הזונה, אחלה.
לא זונה, מלכה.
מלכה של זונות.
לא זונה, תפו חס וחלילה זונה. את תהיי המושיעה של העם שלנו. הסיפור שלך יחיה לנצח, יהיה חג על שמך. חג של שמחה, וילדות קטנות יחכו כל השנה לחג הזה כדי להתחפש לאסתר.
אז הם התחפשו לזונות?
רק בתיכון.
All right, so that was just a little fun. I'm seeing some thumbs up and some laughter. So I'm glad people enjoyed that little reimagining a bit of the discussion between Mordecai and Esther. That is at the heart of the story of Purim. What, Louis?
I think in today's culture, he'd be called into the HR department and sent off to sensitization.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. I think so. But yeah, I just I really love that show, and I love what they do with Jewish history. Well, and you'll see they also lampoon commentators and Talmud and other things, so they'll be coming back. Don't worry. But I wanted to share that little bit with you. So now we're going to get to kind of the meat of what we're going to talk about today, which is prophets. Who were these prophets? Who were all? There were many of them. I named a few of the big ones, but there were a lot. There's a very funny Yehudim Ba'im sketch that doesn't have English translations on the bottom. That's about, there's one prophet in the Bible named Ovadia who only has one chapter. And so there's this whole sketch of like him getting Tanakh and realizing that he only got one chapter, and like how could they have cut his masterwork down to just one? And then like Jeremiah comes by and like makes fun of him for only getting one chapter in because he gets a lot. It's great. Anyway, so we are going to talk about the prophets. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Great. And we are going to first read this quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who wrote a book called The Prophets. He's known for a lot of things, but actually his first published book was about the prophets. It was an extension of his doctoral thesis in Germany. And so do I have a volunteer to read this quote? Who can channel Heschel for us? Thank you, Cindy.
The prophets discovered the holy dimension of living, by which our right to live and survive is measured. However, the holy dimension was not a mechanical magnitude, measurable by the yardstick of deed and reward, of crime and punishment, by a cold law of justice. They did not proclaim a universal moral mechanism, but a spiritual order in which justice was the course, but not the source. To them, justice was not a static principle, but a surge sweeping from the inwardness of God, in which the deeds of man find, as it were, approval or disapproval, joy or sorrow. There was a surge of divine pathos, which came to the souls of the prophets like a fierce passion, startlingly shaking, burning, and led them forth to the peerless defiance of people's self-assurance and contentment.
Okay, so this paragraph is classic Heschel for a number of reasons. One is because it doesn't totally make sense. Heschel often would write in very dense prose and would use a lot of words that when put together have beautiful meaning, but are also very difficult to understand exactly what he's talking about. So I'm just going to kind of paraphrase here in this idea that the key line here that I want to kind of focus on is this idea of that there was a surge of divine pathos which came to the souls of the prophets. That in Heschel's vision, what it meant to be a prophet was that God, in all of God's feeling and all of God's pathos, reached out into the souls of the prophet and gave them the words with which to speak, that they were channeling God's pleasure or more often displeasure with what was happening on earth, and they spoke with the assuredness of someone who has felt divine anger, and they spoke with a heightened sense of importance, that things were not merely good or bad, right or wrong. As he says, it's not an idea of deed and reward, it's idea of the highest possible stakes, that to the prophet everything had the highest possible stakes. So what we're going to do now is we are going to focus on the prophetic concept of justice, and we're going to split into chavruta. We're going to go into learning partnership. I am going to paste right now in 1 second the source sheet into the chat, and then I'm going to make sure everyone has time to copy the source sheet this time. So there you go. So make sure you open that in a new tab before I split you all up. But you're going to be mostly... Yes.
Can you make sure that I'm in like a group of 3? Because I'm probably not going to be able to talk much and be a very good partner. I've got this.
Yes, we have an odd number, so that's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
So you'll be in a group of 3. And there will be, you'll see on that source sheet, there are quotations. And again, one of the things I said was we are going to be talking a lot in this class about how each of the texts that we are going to builds from the previous text. So you'll see we're actually going to start with a text from Deuteronomy, from the Torah, and then we're going to go into the Nevi'im. Then we're going to go into the prophets. You're also seeing some quotes from some Greek philosophers who were perhaps contemporaries of some of these prophets. So these are older classical philosophers. They're not more modern philosophers, but they're older philosophers talking about their conceptions of justice. And there are going to be some questions there about how you view justice in relation to these prophets' descriptions and in relation to the descriptions of some of these other philosophers. So I'm going to go ahead and split you up. Oh, there's Ermi. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and split you up into breakout rooms. And you hopefully have your thing open. I'm gonna put it again here. So Ermi, we're about to split up into breakout rooms. If you want to click on this link, it'll take you to the source sheet that we're going to be looking at. And I am gonna get those breakout rooms ready right now. Create how many of there are? So there'll be 6, so 5 breakout rooms. Okay, and I'm going to assign them manually.
Jeff, the link is in the chat. Control H or hit the chat.
Oh, that's right. Control
yeah.
H. I forget the memory's not so good.
All right, 1 second. I'm just putting you all into your rooms. All right. Okay, I'm gonna hit open all rooms, and you should be able to head on in. All right, Cindy, are you able to join your room? Good. Faye and Alan, are you able to go to your room? Faye and Alan, are you heading? Can you head to your breakout room? There you go. All right. Renee, are you there? Oh, you're still not in connecting audio. Hello.
Hello.
How was your time in your breakout room?
It was good.
Yeah, some good discussion.
Good discussion.
Excellent.
Got to see baby Solomon.
Oh, always a good time when you get to see baby Solomon.
Always. Perfect age.
He's being a little unruly this evening. He just wants to press all the buttons on my computer. Can you say hello? Can you wave?
All right, everyone will be coming back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Come on back. There we go. It's always a good sign when folks have to get dragged back at the end of those 60 seconds. That means that there was some good talking. People had last things they wanted to say. So I know that many of you may not have gotten through all of the sources. It was a longer sheet than you had time for. That's very okay. The goal is to learn with the sources that you have, not to necessarily. It's not a race to make your way through all of them. Something I should have said at the beginning. So I hope no one felt that they were too rushed. But I want to take a second now to hear. I bounced around a little bit and I heard a little bit of what y'all talked about, but I'd love to hear any interesting thoughts or any interesting ideas that came up in your chavrutas, in your studying. Was there something that you heard that you found particularly insightful, that you particularly agreed with, or that you particularly disagreed with or didn't like? Would love to hear. Jeff, if you're saying something, you're muted, so I can't hear you. You're still muted. Let me try this. All right. Anyone while Jeff is working on unmuting, it's usually in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, Jeff, on your Zoom. Bottom left-hand corner, the mute button.
You can also hit Alt-A.
Yes, Alt-A also works.
I'm back in Zoom.
You're back, Louis.
Yes, Marta had the best thing. She said the Greek guys seemed to summarize it in 3 lines, and the rest of us all had to say a big, huge section.
Interesting. What? Say more. Marta, say more about that.
So the non-Jewish writers wrote what they thought was justice in 1 sentence each, whereas the Jewish sources had a lot more words to try and describe what justice is.
It's true. We're not necessarily known for the concise nature of our statements there. That's a fair point. Charlie.
I agree with that, and I think that when you quote the Greek philosophers, they try to sum their ideas up more coherently. But I think both in the Jewish religious text and in their texts, they elaborate and give lots of examples to help people build a better picture. And I think that's what makes it longer.
Yeah. And I also think that it's not just about that. I think there's something non-systemic that the whole point of Greek philosophy is to create a system that you're using proofs and you're using, logic to build upon the other. And the prophets are not trying to use logic. That's not their goal. They have very different goals than Aristotle or Plato, who want to try to prove because X equals Y, then Y equals Z. That's not the prophet's goal. The prophet's goal is to speak for God, which is a totally different idea, really, which I think is part of why you get these different things. And like you said, yes, there's certainly statements and elaboration. And I pulled the 1 line from the Greek in part because I just wanted to be able to have it go more quickly and not take up too much time. And also because it gets very confusing very quickly when you actually get into their logical proofs of justice. But it's also about what is the goal. And the goal is not to be systemic for the prophets. The goal is not a system necessarily. The goal is a speaking for God. Nathan, it looked like you were about to say something.
No, I would say the prophets also spoke poetically, more so than the Greeks didn't. That was not what how they wrote their works.
Absolutely. Right. So there was different form and a different style.
I would say Isaiah was kind of real passionate about when he was talking to the people and trying to get his point across. And you know, we talked in our group how you could actually hear it, you know, even with just reading it, you could hear it in your head how he was trying to get it across.
You could see the angry fist shaking, just like in the mind's eye.
Were there any passages that particularly spoke to y'all, or particularly, you know, made you think about how whether or not we are living our lives in a just or less just way?
Shouting with the ram's horn, that kind of got my attention.
What about it?
It's just kind of like the loudest person. Do they yell out their opinion, or is it just they're sounding you out with the ram's horn to get your attention, to call your attention to what should be the justice point?
Jeff, I see you are unmuted now.
It took a while.
So what was worth it to go through all that to unmute to share with us?
We had a quote from Spider-Man. What was it? I forgot.
With great power.
Jeremy, it was your...
Yeah, you said it.
Jeremy?
With great power comes great responsibility. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was it.
So almost the opposite of one of the Greeks, that it's not that with power comes justice, but with power comes responsibility. And I think that's a really interesting lens through which to view. There's two major lenses in modern and in classical philosophy through which the philosophers view justice. One is through the lens of rights, and the other is through the lens of obligations. So it's an interesting thing to think about what are the things that we have rights to and what are the things that we have obligations to. And what seems clear from the prophetic writings, that the prophets viewed it as rights for those who have less power and obligations for those who have more power, which is exactly what you said, Jeff, of with great power comes great responsibility, that in Judaism with power comes obligation. With power comes obligation to help those who are less fortunate, and being less fortunate and everyone has certain inalienable rights, if you will, but those rights need to be protected, that they're not, granted, that it's not God who's going to stand up necessarily for people's rights, but it's actually up to people. And it's up to people, particularly those with more power, to stand up for them. And one of the things, and yeah, Marta.
So wasn't the prophet's motive actually to promote behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely.
They were.
And in reading the prophets, it seems that they promoted behaviors that would bring one closer to God. That God's pathos that we talked about before was a pain at being distant from the Israelites, at being distant from the Jewish people. And the reason that there was distance between God and the Israelites, between God and the Jewish people, was because they were behaving badly. Whether that was because they were worshiping idols or worshiping false gods, or because they were mistreating other humans. And that mistreatment created distance between God and humanity, and between God and the Jewish people, that God didn't want. And so God, in God's pain, spoke through the prophets to try to bring the people close again, to try to create that closer connection that would allow us to live. And I think that, when I started off by saying, who do you think of when you think of someone who's a prophet? To me, when I think about who are prophetic calls that we need to be heeding, it's who is speaking to that pain of God being far away from us. Because I think that we do live in a world in which we sometimes can feel that God is far from us. And I would hope that God feels that pain also, and is wanting to be close to us. And it's the people who call upon us to do better to do better, to make the world a better place, and who do it, as Nathan said, without regard for the trouble they might get in, or without the regard for how that's going to go over with the people in power. That it's the truth, that speaking the truth of how we can become as a people closer to God. That's what it means to be a prophet. And so I want to close with, or I want to offer if anyone else wanted to yeah, Alan and Faye.
And actually, I was gonna kind of about to say the same thing, and that is, I think if you take and extrapolate it to present day situation, I think you can very easily extrapolate that God is further away with everything that's going on, in not just in our community, in our country, but across the world right now. One can get the sense that we definitely would need, could use a prophet or somebody who could be there to talk about where things should be, because I feel like we keep moving further and further away. I've lived through the 60s and stuff, and other situations, but always felt, even in that time, that there were changes trying to be made to make things better for people, as opposed to the way you feel in the last several years, where things are being torn apart. Right.
Yeah, and I said at the beginning that each class would have a text and would have a theme. And when I was bouncing around in your breakout rooms, I heard Lee mention tikkun olam, this idea that we need to fix the world. And there's an idea that actually comes much later, that tikkun olam isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible, this idea of fixing the world. It actually doesn't come up until it starts getting mentioned in the Mishnah, and then it really gets developed by the Kabbalists, this idea of what it means to fix the world. But the root of it, the heart of it, what I wanted to focus on this week was this idea of justice, was this idea of how do we listen to the prophets, and what does it mean about making the world a more just place, and what is our role as Jewish people in making that happen, or just as people, not even Jewish people, just in terms of how do we listen to the prophets and not shut them out. So I wanted to close with a couple more words of Heschel's, and then a couple more words of the prophets. Heschel said that when the prophets appeared, they proclaimed that might is not supreme. They came into a world in which, as the Greek guy whose name I forget said, might was right, that whoever had the most power was right. And when the prophets appeared, they proclaimed that might is not supreme, that the sword is an abomination, that violence is obscene. The sword, they said, shall be destroyed. And we have the quote from Isaiah that many of you probably know. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama, that even their prophetic visions were ones in which the world would become a better place. And then Amos reifying what we read in Isaiah, if you offer me burnt offerings or meal offerings, or in our parlance, perhaps, if you offer me up your prayers, I will not accept them. I will pay no heed to these gifts. Spare me the sounds of your hymns, and let me not hear the music of your lutes, but let justice well up like water and righteousness like an unfailing stream. We'll talk in future weeks about prayer, about the Siddur, about all of those things, because they are also important. That this is not to say that prayer is not important and hymns and the music is not wonderful. But really, when we look to the prophets over and over again, what we hear, what God wants, is for us to do right, to live justly, and to walk humbly with the Lord, in the words of the prophet Micah at the very end of the book of prophets, the very last quotation there. So thank y'all for joining me tonight. Next week, we will be fast forwarding ahead to Midrash. We're going to do a little bit of learning about the exegesis on the Bible, about the use of biblical texts to be the starting point, the leaping off point for the rabbinic imagination, for stories, for parables, for all of that. So we're going to get into some fun and interesting stories, and we'll be learning a lot more next week, and I hope to see y'all then. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you, Reverend.
Thank you.
Say bye-bye.
Bye, Solomon.
He doesn't want to leave. Say bye-bye.
So he loves Torah, he just wants to learn more and more.
Rabbi, are you enjoying fall finally?
Yes, absolutely. We went apple picking last week. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I bet you thought the heat when you came would last forever.
We've been having a great time.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
All right. Take care, Jeff.
Take care.
Bye.